Next question. Aristotle said something to the effect of, if we just had enough friendship, there'd be no need for politics. Do I agree? So there's two ways I can answer that question. One, is that the correct interpretation of Aristotle? And two, do I just agree with the statement on face value? And I'm just going to answer the second for now. Do I agree with the statement? No, I don't. And I think what's wrong with that statement, and I think it's quite a common feeling, you don't need to go back to Aristotle, but there's this idea of politics and the political as a necessary evil. And actually I'd argue the political is both inescapable and desirable. So I think when people say politics, they tend to mean one specific arena of politics, which is the operation of state power. It's possible to imagine a world without that, although I think even there you're being really idealistic, and I think the effects of dismantling state power would likely be negative. I think the alternatives to state power in the world as we know it today are increased corporate power in first world countries and non-functioning societies, something like Somalia, in the developing world. And I actually think the nation-state, for all its flaws, is more desirable than either of those two extremes. But there's actually a deeper point here, which is the conception of the political that the question implies is very, very narrow. So I see the political as something much broader than that, and indeed how we use the word politics in contemporary English is much broader than that. It applies to a much broader range of phenomenon. And a point I keep coming back to is that if we use language in a strict nominalist way, we're gonna get tripped up. So there is not one thing which is politics. There's not a precise definition of what the political is. The political is many things. It's a cluster, it's a profile of a number of recurring themes. So to cash that out a little, this is the definition offered of the political in Michael Frieden's The Political Theory of Political Thinking, and I interview Frieden on the show if you want more in detail of this. But he provides the following definition of political, and I'll just read you this one paragraph. I submit that we tend to allocate the term politics or political to the following features of social conduct. A. Appropriating the locus of ultimate decision-making. B. Distributing material or symbolic goods. C. Mobilizing or withdrawing public support. D. Organizing the social complexities through which stability or conflict and disruption are manufactured. E. Policy making and option selecting for collectives. F. Wielding power. So that's quite a lot there, and I'm not going to go through that whole definition, but the point is that by that definition of politics, that there is a political aspect to every conversation we have with another person. So to just take a couple of these, policy making and option selection. The political is, in part, one of the dimensions of the political is any act of prioritization or goal setting within a collective is political, right? So yes, that applies to like approving a state budget, but it also applies to a family. So if you consider in any friendship, any family, they're going to be decisions. They're going to be acts of prioritization. Do we have dinner now, or do we have dinner at 9 p.m? Do we have dinner together, or do we have it separately? All of those are just acts of goal setting and prioritization. So within any social group, there's going to be that goal setting, and it's necessary that there is. Also, the operation of power. Power can be unpleasant in terms of threats or menace, but it can also be something that's very positive and very desirable. If you within a family, let's just take the when do we have dinner example, you might say, hey, I just want to eat by myself. But then someone else might want to say, well, listen, I just think it will be more pleasant if we all eat together, and even if it's a bit awkward at first, I really want to hear how your day's been, I really just want to know what's going on in your life, and I'd love it if I could just listen to you for, 20 minutes of the day instead of, and you can play your video games or whatever afterwards, and you hear that and you go, you know what, you're right. I want you to know how my day's been, and I want to know how your day's been. And you're persuaded. But persuasion is an act of power. To persuade someone is to exert power over them. Which brings me to my next point, which is the desirability of politics. So firstly, it's really impossible to get away from a society in which there's an operation of power. Remembering that power isn't just decision-making. It's also agenda setting and persuasion. So there's always going to be power. Even in the Aristotelian sense of friendship, if you are deciding which bar you go to drink with your friends. By the way, Aristotle was okay with drinking, providing it was in moderation. Well, in deciding that, there's an act of agenda setting. There might be the other aspects that we took here, mobilizing or withholding of support, distributing material or symbolic goods, who picks up the check, but there'll certainly be an aspect of power. I'll persuade you that this bar is actually the better one. Right? You'll withhold or give me your support for that. So the politics is always with us. And in order to imagine a society without politics, you'd have to imagine a society of Robinson Crusoes. You'd have to imagine a society of people who are completely isolated, physically isolated from their fellow human beings. And that brings me to my second point, which it just isn't desirable that we be free from politics. Politics is a good thing. It can be used negatively. But the idea that we can set agendas, that we can set visions for the future, that we can persuade others, all of these can be harmful, but they can also be very positive. And a society of Robinson Crusoes would not be desirable. Which, as a final point, isn't it interesting how central the idea of Robinson Crusoe as a metaphor has been to economic thought, to neoliberal thought, and to libertarian thought? This fantastical idea of a completely isolated man, which of course is mirrored in the strict isolation of human beings, the atomized view of society, the impoverished, emaciated view of human nature as merely pursuing rational self-interest, stripped of any sociability or outgoingness that we find in someone like Nozick. Or the abstract individualism that we find in someone like Rawls. There's a much better tradition within liberalism, whereas in fact there's actually a much deeper and a much better tradition within liberalism of something like J.S. Mill or Hobson or Hobhouse, where we're interested in promoting the individual, promoting individual development and autonomous growth and flourishing from real individuals within the context of these individuals existing in social frameworks, in relationships, in families and in marriages, and in a certain state of society and in a certain state of social development. And that leads to a much better and a much more inspiring political theory, a much richer one and a much more applicable one, I would argue, is a theory that starts with the reality of politics, rather than deluding ourselves that it's possible to have a society without politics, as Rawls does in Political Liberalism, where he imagines that we can fully separate political values from social ones. And if you want to see a full critique of that, check out Wittgenstein versus Rawls on this podcast. But that's my answer. No, we can't live without politics. It's inescapable. And even if it were, it's not desirable. And finally, we do much better political theory and political thinking when we take those realities into account.